Hello, folks, and welcome to another episode of the Athenianos podcast. Um, Today I just wanted to do an episode because I was in the library studying for exams, and I just had some thoughts, and I thought initially I was like, oh, why don't I just tweet them? But instead of tweeting them, I thought, you know what, I'll just record them in a short episode and flush them out. I figure that's a better way to kind of get rid of our thoughts or ideas. Not get rid of, but you know what I mean. Put them out there and flush them out rather than just sending them in a tweet or Instagram story. Um, so yeah, if you guys are interested and want to follow the trend, please do so. And if you don't know how to do so, or you're scared to put your name to your ideas that you've had, you can just send them to me and I'll post them anonymously if you want. So yeah, um, enough said. Like and subscribe as always. Um, let's get into it. So I'm writing a bunch of politics essays, and of course, a big theme is power. Um, and I was kind of thinking about, power and trying to analyze my own self and others. And I just kind of had this thought while I was sitting there writing about Syria and Yemen and Bahrain. Um, Totally unrelated to those, but I was thinking, it seems like to me that there's a relationship between like boldness of action and power. And the kind of way I was thinking about it was, like I thought about it like one of those x y equals x squared graphs. It kind of look like this. Where like, oh, here's a picture. I don't know if you can see this. Maybe I'll put it better in the film. But basically, you have y equals x squared, or let's say y equals x minus 5 squared in parentheses. And you have like 10 being the most power and 0 being the least amount of power. And it seems like those who have the smallest amount of power, for some reason, um, tend to. There seems to be a similarity between those who have the least amount of power and those who have the most amount of power in terms of their boldness of action, right? And then I was thinking about it, and I was like, well, what really is boldness? What are we talking about when we mean boldness of action? And I thought, well, okay, it's like you're exercising your power, how much power you exercise. So I was thinking, okay, so maybe the relationship is more um, the amount of power you have to the amount of power you're willing to yield. But it doesn't really make any sense because um, how could those with the smallest amount of power be yielding an equal amount of power to those with the largest amount of power? So I said, okay, well, then it must be that the relationship is between percentage of power, percentage of your power that you exercise. So it's the people with the smallest amount of power are exercising related to the amount of power they have. They're exercising the same percentage of their power as those with a lot of power. And then you kind of have those in the middle at the 5 range that are exercising the least amount of power. And I thought, well, why is that if this is true? And again, this is based on no scientific analysis or research. It's just instinct and observing my own self and others. Um, but in some ways, it makes sense, right? Because you have those in the middle who don't have all this stuff, and uh, but at the same time have something, and so they're conscious of the fact that if they try too hard, or if they exert too much of their power that they have, then they might end up in the lower power, and they don't want to go there, so they're nervous, and that stops them from exercising. Uh, that stops them from either going to the lower amounts of power or the higher amounts of power. So they just stay in the middle and don't really wage their power, don't really wage their voice. And then I thought, well, but then how could people in the middle ever move toward the lower ends or the higher ends, right? Because then it would just be, the way I put it is, it would just be stagnant. Um, and I thought, well, it can't be materially, because that doesn't make any sense. Because if you're in the middle and you don't have, you have middle resources, but you don't want to wager, um, a lot of your resources, or you don't, and at the same time, right, you don't want to wager a lot of resources, so you don't end up going higher, and you don't really end up going lower, but you're more conservative in your actions. Um, well, except for a few exceptions, obviously, to this theory, it would seem like materially there would be no shifts, but there are shifts. So I thought, okay, so it must be psychological, or it must be, yeah, it must be psychological, right? So I was thinking, so it's got to be perceived power. So the relationship has to be, it's got to be something in the mind, a switch in the mind, right? So the relationship must be between perceived power and uh, the percentage of that perceived power that you're willing to wage or put out there or exercise, let's say. Um, and so that's an interesting relationship. And obviously, material factors factor into your perceived and psychological power a lot, right? Because if you have $10 billion, well, you're gonna perceive that you have a lot of power, and probably, you know, you may be right in saying so. And if you're dirt poor and living on the streets, well, you're gonna perceive yourself as having less power. And I don't know, maybe that's the case. Um, and it's interesting because I was just thinking about all of this on my walk home. It's a long walk for those who don't know. I live about 45 minutes on foot from the main library. So it's a lot of time to think, and I do, and have a lot of thoughts. But thinking, this theory is not that, the idea that the switch happens psychologically in your perceptions is not that different, right, than what we think about in a lot of, power theories. And when we think about revolutions, right, a lot of times people say, oh, it has to have, you have to engage the working class, the lower class, because those are the most likely to take risks, right? They're the most willing to um, lose their lives for the cause, exercise the most that they have. Whereas people in the middle class, eh, they've got stuff that they're not willing to necessarily um, lose all the time. And then you have people at the top uh, who are the vanguards, are leading the cause, right? There's always needs to be like, for every, um, whatever, 10 million Russians, you got to have one Lenin, you know? For every, 10 million French peasants, you have to have a Robespierre, something like that. For every American farmer, you have to have Thomas Jefferson or George Washington, right? You need the combination of the elites, and you need the lower classes, the poor people. Um, and so it makes sense, right? I think that's at least the theory. But it's interesting to think about it happening psychologically, because when you think about Marxist theory of revolutions, right? As far as I can tell, what he talks about is not the the workers themselves right? And their conditions themselves, they're going to make them revolutionaries to take bold action. But what he's trying to emphasize is a perceptual shift in their thinking, right? To perceive, to recognize that they are in the lowest possible position, right? It's he's and they may be, it may be fair to say that they're in the lowest possible position, but what he's advocating is a psychological shift in people. It's you go from thinking that you have something and that you're kind of in the middle, and so that's where you are conservative and don't really take bold action, to making you think that actually, or perceive yourselves as at the bottom of the litter, the lowest of the low, and that's when you'll take bold action. And right, he says that the proletariat, um, you know, need to have class consciousness. Um, right, they need to be aware of this, and that's his whole, theory of how the revolution is going to happen, because they, as a class, everybody in that wide, and look, not everybody, his picture of this dualist nation of, bourgeois and proletariat, it's not perfect. Obviously, nobody can separate the world into two classes. But what he's doing is actually what he's trying to do is, because materially you can't create these two dichotomies because they don't exist. Everybody varies materially. So what he was trying to do and trying to advocate for is a psychological conception of these two classes, right? The proletariat is is the lowest of the low, and the bourgeois is the highest of the high. So it's actually I was thinking about it. It makes sense, right? That you'd have this proportionality where the people in the middle are the most conservative, and then as you get the lowest of the low in perceived power, it goes up in boldness in terms of, or the willingness to exercise percentage of your power, and for for the poorest of the poor, their power or their possessions is their life, so they're willing to risk their lives. And same thing, right? When you think about and it's the same thing for the bourgeois, right? When they perceive themselves as the highest of the high and indestructible. And you see this all the time with these great dictators, get all this power and think they're kings. Um, that's when they take these bold action and they do crazy shit and destroy a lot of people, um, and think they're invincible. Um, but I also think this theory is not just applicable to like politics and revolutions and etc. But it actually can tell us a lot about our own lives and how we go about our own lives, because you know I'll use Twitter followers as an example, right? Let's say you have 4 Twitter followers, right? And they're all kind of your close buddies. You know everybody, and you're thinking, well, there's no consequences, right? I have no power. Nobody's gonna see this shit. Nobody cares. So I'm gonna, post what I really think and put my honest opinion out there and put out that, percentage of my perceived power. Um, and then as you kind of start to accrue followers, you know, and let's say you become 50, 100, 150 followers, then you're thinking, some people are gonna see this, maybe some distant friends or distant relatives or, teachers or lecturers, etc. I have to be a little bit more careful about what I'm gonna do, because everybody's gonna see it, and they still have some control over my life, and it could still impact me. I'm not totally out of the woods. And then maybe when you have, 500,000, a million, 2 million, 5 million, a billion followers, right? Then you're thinking, oh, I've got all this, power, and I don't really, give a shit what people think, because, you know, nobody can do anything, right? I'm indestructible. I've built myself to the capacity. Well, I'm at fucking 1 billion followers. You know, what are you gonna do to me, right? Um, and so then you start getting bold again, and you start, doing Donald Trump tweets on a toilet bowl, you know, But in all seriousness, that's kind of, that's kind of. And I know you could say the same thing about Instagram. You could say the same thing about, um, position in a company, right? When you're like the lowest of the low, and it's a shit company, and you're barely getting paid, you know, you'll go on strike, you'll stand up, you'll say all these things, you'll be bold. But if you're kind of mid-level range at a good salary, comfortable, you're not going to be the one who's like, oh, we got to unite against, the boss and poison his drink or whatever. Um, that's from a Seinfeld episode, by the way. Um, the poison the boss's drink. But, then when you're the boss and you've been the boss for, 5, 10, 15 years, and you've solidified your position, and you basically run the company and own the place, then, you put your feet up on your desk, right? You show up late because you don't give a shit, because you have all this power that you can yield. And yeah, so I think we can take that to our own lives and not just apply it to the political situation. So yeah, um, like I said, like and subscribe. I'm gonna edit out the part about my roommates because that was weird. And see you next time. Also, hi mom and dad. Miss you guys.